and we again welcome you to the Forward Janesville All-Member Conference Call for this month. I would like to start out, of course, by thanking our sponsor of these calls, BMO Harris Bank. BMO Harris Bank has dedicated bankers in the local market who understand your business, industry, and market, and offer solutions tailored to your unique needs. BMO has deep roots in the community with a long history of supporting Forward Janesville and other local nonprofits. I'd like to personally thank BMO Harris for helping us put these conference calls together. It's an important way for us to reach out to our members and provide them with quality, valuable information. This time I'd like to start out, however, just by mentioning a couple of things. We, I think, like most of our business members, have our sights set on a changing landscape as it relates to this pandemic. We are operating at full capacity. I'm pleased to report that since we talked last month, we have 8 new members. So membership is growing again, and that's obviously a very positive sign in an association like ours. We also, last week at our board meeting, voted to accept the nominating committee's suggestion of 2 new board members. We'd like to welcome John Ballard, who's the president and CEO of Foremost Media, and George Cullen, who is the co-president of J.P. Cullen Associates. John and George will begin their tenure as board members next month, and we welcome them. I hope they're on the line. So let's get started. We have 3 speakers today. Sal Guatieri, I hope I got that right, Sal Guatieri.
You did.
Sal's the senior economist and director of BMO Capital Markets, and he'll discuss the early actions of the Biden administration and what to expect with the upcoming stimulus package. We also have Oakleigh Ryan from Whiton Consulting, who also happens to be a member of the Forward Janesville Executive Leadership Team, and she will be giving an update on the search for my replacement. As I'm looking down the barrel at retirement, they are actively involved in a search process, and she's going to update you on that. And then Dan Cunningham from our staff will give you an update on the City of Janesville's proposed transportation utility. Some of you may have been tuning in last night to the council meeting. I'll let Dan fill you in on the details, but it was an interesting meeting, and there are some new developments as of today that Dan will talk about. So we're going to start first with Sal Guatieri, again, a senior economist and director of BMO Capital Markets. Sal, if I could turn the floor over to you, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. So here's what we should expect from the American Rescue Plan bill that's currently winding its way through the reconciliation process, and from other fiscal policies this year, and of course how they might impact the U.S. economy and Wisconsin's businesses. If you take nothing else away from what I say in the next few minutes, just remember this: assuming COVID doesn't mutate into more lethal strain that's resistant to vaccines, a fire hose of policy stimulus is set to drive the U.S. economy probably to its best year in almost 4 decades, and American households to their best year since 1955. Before discussing fiscal policy, though, let me tell you what we think will happen with COVID-19. I mean, that's the one thing that could truly upset the economic apple cart. So we're assuming the country will win this race against the variants. As an accelerating vaccine program should generate herd immunity by early summer. If so, the economy should come storming back, even if there were no further fiscal stimulus. Now, let that sink in for a second, because that's a really important point, and I say it for 4 reasons. First, restrictions on activity, notably social gatherings and indoor dining, will be relaxed as we approach herd immunity and as caseloads keep falling, so too will consumer anxiety. And second, each of us is itching to get out and travel and dine, socialize. We're just bursting at the seams to unleash pent-up demand for deferred services and activities. Third, the average American family is sitting on a hoard of savings built up during the pandemic because they cut spending and after 2 rounds and likely a third of rebate checks. We estimate that households in aggregate have accumulated $1.7 trillion of excess savings in the past year. That's equal to 12% of consumer spending. Now, not all of that cash hoard will be spent on goods and services. Some will be used to invest in assets like second homes or to repay debt. Still, it's a tremendous amount of firepower to drive pent-up demand. And many businesses have also piled up cash, largely for precautionary reasons, and they're poised to invest when confidence picks up. And finally, there's little stopping the housing market from having another hot year, given low interest rates and demand by remote workers. While longer-term interest rates are expected to drift modestly higher this year, the Federal Reserve has strongly signaled no plans to raise policy rates or even cut back purchases of debt securities, and that will act to relieve some of the upward pressure on current record-low mortgage rates. In fact, Chair Powell, just as recently as today before Congress, confirmed that message. So with that rosy backdrop, you might ask yourself, well, why the need for more fiscal juice? Well, like the Fed, the government is eager to get the current 6.3% unemployment rate back to pre-virus levels of 3.5%. And this goal motivated the $900 billion bipartisan bill that was passed in late December, and that included $600 rebate checks to most individuals and an extension of the emergency UI programs. That's why the now Democrat-led Congress is aiming to pass the current $1.9 trillion package, and that includes $1,400 rebate checks, an expansion and extension of UI payments to August, and financial aid to heavily impacted industries and municipal governments. So given possible resistance from one or two fiscally conservative Democrats in the Senate, we don't think all of these proposals will become law, but we are assuming 3/4 will get passed next month. And the rebate checks and UI support alone could spike household personal income by more than 10% in the first quarter. And the earlier rebates explain that massive 5% jump in retail sales last month, and that's going to anchor at least 5% annualized GDP growth in the current quarter. And remember, this is all before the real meat and potatoes of the president's fiscal mandate, which includes trillions of dollars in new spending on infrastructure, education, the environment, health and child care, and affordable housing. If you're worried about plans to raise the corporate income tax rate by 7 points and personal rates on top income earners to finance the increase in spending, which, by the way, could raise nearly $4 trillion of revenue over a decade, that's likely to be deferred, possibly until next year, after the economy is on a sounder footing and the jobless rate is much lower. Now, make no mistake, tax rates are likely going to go up, given that the budget deficit is poised to hit a record $3.5 trillion this fiscal year, according to the Congressional Budget Office. That's a massive 15% of GDP. Now, in addition, the president has no plans to reverse the tariffs on China. A less strident approach to trade relations with the U.S. allies could reduce business anxiety and support investment. And meantime, expanding immigration would help businesses in some industries facing worker shortages to fill positions, while reversing the slowing in U.S. population growth, which at just 0.4% is the weakest since the Second World War. Now, on the downside, a more than doubling of the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour over 4 years could discourage hiring, especially in some hard-hit industries such as food services and travel. And that's why the CBO estimates it could cost over 1 million jobs. Now, overall, the potential good things for the economy that I mentioned should outweigh the bad. So after contracting 3.5% last year, U.S. real GDP is expected to rebound 6% this year and grow a solid 4% next year. So what does this mean for Wisconsin's businesses? Well, the state is largely tracking the nation's so-called K-shaped industry pattern for recovery, where activity in some services industries is just hammered, while other sectors and most sectors have suffered minor damage. So big declines in leisure, hospitality, and entertainment sectors have been partly offset by more resilient manufacturing, construction, and, of course, real estate. Existing home sales in the state were up 23% in the year to December, and median prices jumped 10% last year. So Wisconsin's real GDP, it did fall 2.3% in the year to the third quarter. That's a little lighter than the national hit, but we do expect it to rebound nearly 6% this year. And Wisconsin's jobless rate has fallen from the double digits of last spring to 5.5%. We expect it to drop another percentage point this year before returning to pre-virus levels of 3.5% by late next year. Non-farm payrolls in the state have retraced more than half of their shutdown losses. Now, they're still down 7% or over 200,000 as of December, and about half of that those remaining layoffs are in leisure and hospitality and state and local governments. Now, post-pandemic, Wisconsin's businesses will need to manage some permanent long-run shifts, including increased online shopping, increased use of automation by businesses, and a sustained partial shift toward remote work that will depress office demand. Telework, though, could benefit Wisconsin as some workers flock to less expensive regions from larger, more expensive cities. This could reverse the state's anemic population growth, which is now the lowest in almost 4 decades. And finally, businesses in some hard-hit industries, notably restaurants, will see a resurgence in demand later this year while facing fewer competitors, so they will need to prepare to handle that boom. So, John, I'll turn the floor back to you, but look forward to answering questions later in the session.
Thank you, Sal. I'm sure we'll have many questions because there's a lot to unpack in the comments that you've made there. So just hang in while we cover some other ground. I would encourage our callers, of course, though, to send your questions, if you have them already, for Sal, to forward@forwardjanesville.com. And after our other panelists have completed their comments, we'll have a round-robin open session for questions and answers. I'm going to turn to Dan Cunningham next from Forward Janesville. Dan has been, well, let's just say singularly focused on one topic for a period of time, a proposal for a transportation utility in the city of Janesville. We know from the reaction that we got from our membership, this is of keen interest, and a lot is quite frankly transpired in the last few 24 hours. So Dan, I'm going to give you the floor now and tell our callers about the transportation utility.
Well, thank you, John. Yes, you are correct. I pretty much have been working nonstop for the last few weeks on the city's transportation utility proposal, and some of you have been working with me as well, and I appreciate that very much. So I want to give you some quick background on the issue, kind of how we got to this point, and sort of then talk about what might come in the future. So some quick background. Transportation utility is a funding mechanism for the city's street repair program. This program involves repair and rehabilitation of about 12 miles of streets each year. That's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. Previous to that, we did about 6 miles of rehab and repair per year, and at one point the city council decided to double the street program volume because of, frankly, the complaints that they got from constituents really were about, my road's no good, potholes, things of that nature. So they decided to double the program. The program is currently funded through a combination of general transportation aids from the state and federal government, general obligation note issuance, so in other words, debt, right? The city stormwater utility that pays for curb and gutter, the general property tax levy, and the wheel tax, okay? So Janesville, as you know, as you register your car, you got a $20 wheel tax to pay, right? And along the way, people have said to me, well, why aren't we using the wheel tax to fund our street repair program? That's what it's for, right? Well, it turns out that that only funds about 14% of the overall value of the street repair program, the overall cost, I should say. So if we were to raise the wheel tax to a level sufficient to pay for the street repair program, you'd be paying a wheel tax of about $150 a year. So that's a non-starter for most, but I thought that was an interesting little tidbit there. So according to city staff, the street rehabilitation programs experienced really significant inflationary cost increases in recent years. And this has led to an increased reliance on borrowing for the program. And the city staff and others feel that this increased reliance on borrowing really isn't sustainable. And it's led the city down other paths, looking for other options to pay for the street repair program. So, hence the transportation utility idea. So a transportation utility is a funding mechanism for a city's transportation system that really equates the system to utility, like we would the water or the sewer utilities. Under a transportation utility, a city is essentially declaring its system of roads as a public utility. And user rates are calculated based on the property's use of the transportation system. So the more car trips your property generates, the more you will pay. Naturally, under such a proposal, commercial properties will pay more than residential properties. And the concept of transportation utilities is a fairly new concept. There are really only a handful of them in the nation, and they started mostly in the western states like Colorado and Oregon. However, they have started to gain popularity in Wisconsin, particularly after the Wisconsin League of Municipalities issued an opinion that said the establishment of such utilities is, in fact, allowed under state law. So several cities, including the city of Neenah, have established transportation utilities. The village of Sussex may do so within the next few weeks. So this idea is gaining some momentum. Now, quick sidebar, there are others, including Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the State Chamber of Commerce, who do not believe it is legal for Wisconsin's municipalities to establish transportation utilities. WMC is strongly considering litigating this matter, and they sent several letters to the city of Janesville discouraging the establishment of the utility. That's something that came up last night during the council meeting, frankly, and I think that it did affect some city council members' opinions on this. This is definitely one for the con column, right? So you could have an expensive and protracted legal battle about the legality of this thing that you want to do. So I think that was certainly something that affected the debate last night. So with that backdrop, here's some more information about what the city was actually considering. They had settled on what they called transportation utility option number 4. This option would have completely eliminated the wheel tax and would have borrowed only 25% of the cost of the street repair program in the first year of the utility. So a quick note on the rate framework, 10% of your utility rate would have been a fixed fee, while 90% of the fee is based on the property's classification, which again takes into account how many car trips the property generates. Now, to calculate this data, the city used what's known as the R.A. Smith Trip Database and the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Statistics Manual, Volume 10. So get that all on, write that down. These are very well-established manuals for these sorts of calculations, so this is kind of an industry standard for this sort of thing. So once those numbers were applied, we got an idea of what this would cost residents and businesses. I personally first saw the numbers during a February 4th City Council meeting, and it took me a minute to put my eyes back in my head. We were talking about 5- and 6-figure increases in fees for some businesses, particularly those who generate a lot of traffic, like retailers, gas stations, fast food restaurants, and the like. So during that February 4th meeting, City Council members asked us at Forward Janesville to gather feedback on the proposal from businesses. We spoke to dozens of our members, from sole proprietorships to the largest companies in Janesville, And I got to say, concern about this proposal was not only passionate, but it was unanimous. We have 500 or so members, and they are concerned about issues that are all over the map. It's very rare to get some unanimous thought when we poll our members, but I will say I have not found a business that supported this proposal yet, and we've been talking to a lot of them. The concerns we heard were not only about the size of the fees and really the seismic shift from fees being paid by maybe residential customers to businesses. The timing of the proposal was certainly a concern given the ongoing pandemic and the fact that we've undergone this historic event and recession, and a lot of businesses are just beginning to recover. Also, the accuracy of the numbers being used in the calculations was an issue for people. If we're going to be applying this standard, we got to make sure that our numbers are right so that we can know exactly as a business what we might pay under a transportation utility. One more concern that we heard was the fact that this proposal could put our community really on an island when it comes to economic development. So given the scarcity of these transportation utilities in Wisconsin and across the country, you put yourself at an instant competitive disadvantage from an economic development standpoint, because your neighboring communities would be able to say, well, we don't have this kind of fee, but Janesville does, so why don't you take a look at us? So those were some concerns we heard. We also heard of businesses that might be forced to close if subjected to these fees, and frankly that several desirable economic development projects that are underway could be endangered by this proposal. So we shared all this information with City Council members before their meeting last night. So now we're back up to the present. We asked the City Council to pause this effort and to convene a panel of business and community leaders to find a way forward that everyone can agree on. So after a really enlightening and frankly pretty lengthy debate, the City Council decided last night to pause further action on the transportation utility until after the election and when a new council is seated in April. And while we're happy with that decision, we know that our work is just beginning here at Forward Janesville. Now we have to move into what I call the solution phase. Look, the city had a good reason for considering a transportation utility. They feel like their hands are tied. They're limited in the tax revenues they can raise because of state levy limits. They're faced with flat or declining state and federal aid for road projects. And frankly, if the money's not there for the street repair program, they have to borrow it. So the transportation utility for them was a really kind of an outside-the-box way of solving what is a vexing problem. And we hope that the city will continue to apply that sort of thinking to the issue. And we have pledged to bring our own solutions to the table. In fact, we got emails right after the meeting from city council members saying, hey, let's sit down, let's talk this thing out, let's figure it out. And there's several things we could consider here to help our program be funded. As Sal mentioned, you know, the federal government may be considering an infrastructure package very soon that could provide some relief to state and local governments. At the state level, you think about the governor's proposal for a 0.5% local option sales tax that could be used by municipalities of our size. That would certainly be an interesting proposal and one that we've considered before. Also, state shared revenue reform. I mean, this is an issue that's been around for a long time, where the city of Janesville really gets a kind of a raw deal from the state in terms of what we get in state shared revenue. If the state just brought us up to our peer city average, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, $6 million is what it could gain the city. So we need to keep talking about that, certainly. And from a local standpoint, you know, there's always the option of going to referendum. That's something that was brought up last night by the city council. And another thing that was brought up is examining the streets program, taking another look at it. Do we really need to do 12 miles per year, or have we caught up in the last 5 years to what the need was? And finally, this came up last night as well. When Ehlers and Associates, the city's consultant, first brought this idea to the city, they gave them 7 different transportation utility options. And the one that the city chose to pursue, it was kind of the Cadillac of all the proposals, right? It was the most expensive for businesses. It eliminates the wheel tax, eliminates nearly all borrowing. But there's kind of a sliding scale here. So if for example, one of the proposals that Ehlers put out was, okay, let's say that we keep the wheel tax and we borrow 50% of the cost of the program in the first year. What would that cost? So we think we need to go back and look at some of those proposals and see what they might actually cost, now that we do have some numbers for what the transportation utility could cost. So there's a lot of potential solutions out there on the table. There's also looking at what other states do on this, because this is a problem nationwide. So, when we decided to oppose the utility proposal, we knew we had to be a partner, and we knew we had to offer solutions to them. We can't just say no. We need to help them solve this problem, because it truly is a problem. So look for more information on this topic from me in the coming weeks and months, and please do share your input with us. If you come across an idea for transportation funding that you find to be revolutionary and might have some merit, please send it our way. We would really love to hear about that stuff. So I want to thank everybody who weighed in to the City Council about this important issue. It's always easy to do my job when we get such great response to things like this, when we have an issue that's this important, and people will respond to my emails and please write a letter to the City Council. That really helps me out a lot, so it's very gratifying. So with that, John, I'll turn it back to you and be looking forward to answering any questions anyone has. Thanks.
Great. And we already have some questions for you. We'll hold those off until we have heard from Oakleigh, but I think there's a lot of interest in this particular proposal, even after last night. So we'll be talking more about that, as you said. Our third panelist today is Oakleigh Ryan of Whiton Consulting, the chair-elect of the Forward Janesville Board, and the chair of the search committee, who's undertaking a nationwide search to find my replacement. So, Oakleigh, if you would like to pipe in and inform the membership on the work that you're doing as it relates to the search.
John, thank you so much. And, just listening to Dan, thank you for being able to summarize that, all the work that's been done, the complicated issue in a way that I understood. So you've got a talent for that. We're lucky to have you. And it's why, having a strong organization with a strong leader is so important, so we can do work like that. So I appreciate that. Thanks, John, for being a good sport. So you probably were expecting to be doing some more music this time last year, but you're still leading our organization and our community's economic and community development efforts for the private sector, and we're very thankful. So let me just start by sharing where we are today. After what I would call a fairly extensive interview process that started and stopped and restarted in the fall in 2020, Forward Janesville has finally decided to update the process and bring in another partner. And so we have selected QTI Group's executive search team, and that's led by CEO Londa Dewey out of Madison, to assist us in finding our new leader. QTI is a Wisconsin-based organization. It's been around for several decades and is a whole human resource solution organization. So we're very excited. We're equally excited that and lucky that John's been willing to remain in his role in a year that really required all hands on deck in Janesville and at Forward Janesville. At the outset, I don't know if he had his fingers crossed when he said this, but John always encouraged the board, the executive committee, to take the time to find the right leader for our organization and what clearly is his organization that he has obviously grown very fond. It's clearly not just a job for John. It's his community, and we appreciate that. And he did not want his targeted retirement to force the decision. So we took him up on that offer. We met some great candidates in 2020 and had the opportunity, honestly, to talk about Janesville and what we're doing here across the state and even across some of our state lines. But ultimately, the search committee, with the recommendation, we wanted to expand our search. We hadn't found our candidate yet. So after some final interviews in November, the search committee recommended to the board and John that we find a more national-based partner, and they accepted that. I do want to do a call-out for Rick Richard of RD Worldwide. They were our partner in 2020 and were phenomenal. Rick was great, and he was on board with that recommendation. So in January, we started discussions with about 6 firms that I got based on referrals of executive search firms. We identified 2 for really in-person Zoom interviews. We did that with the executive committee, and then we made a recommendation to go with QTI at our recently in January. And I just want to share with you some of the reasons why. And I'm really excited. When you work with a consultant or another organization, it's an opportunity to form a partnership that goes beyond the task at hand, and I think that will be true of QTI. One is because they're a whole human resource solutions firm. I think they're going to be a resource for us going forward, whether it's professional development for our staff or networking throughout the state, but I'm excited for a long-term relationship. They did a great job on our interview of convincing us that they are excited about Janesville, they know Janesville, and they think there's great opportunities. And we want to showcase that, and we want a partner that's equally as excited about the future and our opportunities. Londa's been in our shoes. She led one of the divisions of the U.S. Bank up in Madison for 2 decades. She served on boards, and so she's been in the private sector, so she knows she's walked in our shoes. They've also recently done a successful placement with the Madison MadRep, the regional economic group based in Madison, and they also did the 2 hires for the Madison Chamber. Currently Zach now and his predecessor. So they've got a track record. They also had great customer service and a team approach while we were interviewing them. And finally, they do, as is fairly standard, though, provide a 1-year guarantee. If in the small chance that the person we select does not work out in the first year, they'll be our partner again with no charge. So just kind of giving you some details of what to expect. Our search committee that worked in 2020 in the fall is 8 members. We have the executive committee, which is Tim Lindau. We've got Dave Hiller, and then we've got Lynn Gardner. And then we've got representatives from kind of key member groupings. So we're very happy to have Jenny McCarthy, who represents Join Janesville, our rising professional group. We also have Barry Brandt, that was a former board chair, very active in the community, and really, I think, has a nice connection with multiple stakeholders in the community. He recently was tasked to be one of the co-chairs of the county COVID task force. And then 2 members of the committee that are exceptionally, I think, important to this process of continuity is Steve Kennedy came on board and Dave Cullen. Interesting, those gentlemen were both involved in the hire of John. They were very active when Forward Janesville reorganized and became Forward Janesville in the late 1990s, and understand the high bar that was established back then and that we want to maintain. So that continuity has been very important. We provided a candidate profile and all the interviewing process material that we developed to QTI so that we can kind of fast track this. But we are going to take a step at their recommendation, and we're going to update the candidate profile. And this is my message to you. We'll send a press release out today announcing QTI's selection, and then what we're going to be doing is sending a simple survey to all our members, just asking for some input on that characteristics and expectations of our next leader, as well as for the future of Forward Janesville. This is your organization, and we like that input process. The search is scheduled to be launched in early March once we update our candidate profile, and we're hoping to have a new CEO to help John celebrate his retirement post-4th of July. Good reasons for fireworks, right, John? So I just want to close by saying this. You try to look for silver linings in difficult times, and I believe we were presented with that at Forward Janesville. The pandemic absolutely pushed back our timeline to find a new successor by a year, but we think that's okay. It really is in a time of crisis that you learn what matters and what truly creates values for our members. This last year really helped solidify to the board, I think to our staff, to so many people, what are the CEO leadership profile that really can deliver that value. We absolutely believe we have a stronger team at FJ because of this crisis that's going to benefit our new CEO, and we've made internal operational process changes, just as you all have, to be a stronger organization. All that means to me and to our search committee is that our CEO is going to get a better, actually stronger organization. So we're excited. A press release goes out this afternoon. There will be contacts in there. And if you have any questions on the process, it's your organization. Please reach out to me. It will be in the press release. If you have any potential candidates in mind, near or far, it is a national search. There will be a contact for Justine Rose, who's our day-to-day partner from QTI. So with that, I'll hand over to you, John.
Thank you, Oakleigh, and thank you for the generous, kind words. I do look forward to retirement, but I also have to say I do love working here, and I'm going to enjoy these last few months. Sal, we have some questions that have been submitted. One of them actually ties in a little bit with what Dan was talking about, and that is the infrastructure bill and the transportation infrastructure bill that has been talked about for years, of course, but there's hope, I think, that the Biden administration will prioritize that. It seems that it has supporters on both sides of the aisle. Can you give us an idea of the scope and size of that proposed infrastructure bill and what that might mean for the state of Wisconsin or even a city like Janesville?
Well, John, yeah, the infrastructure bill is certainly one that stands a pretty good chance of getting through Congress. Infrastructure tends to have pretty broad bipartisan support, and even the Democrats, although they hold the Senate by the thinnest of majorities, it probably needs some bipartisan support to get some of the big spending plans passed, and infrastructure could fall along those lines. So, I mean, we would expect a pretty sizable package. Now, the one thing about infrastructure is it tends to be spread out over years. It takes time before we get to see the actual shovels in the ground, but I would expect it to be a source of stimulus for most states over the next few years or so. And it's one of those areas where you get longer term benefits, not just the short term bang for your buck. Unlike the rebate checks, you tend to get the productivity improvements and enhancements along with it that tend to support longer term economic growth. So I think there's a good chance we will see quite a bit of money allocated towards infrastructure over the next couple of years or so, and it will help pretty well all states, including Wisconsin.
I would a follow-up on that is, at what point does all of this debt financing cause some sort of complication, shall we say? What is the implication for a debt growing the way it is? Obviously we have to service that debt. We're fortunate to have historically low interest rates, but as an economist, do you look at this and say a day of reckoning is off into the future at some point?
At some point, we have to pay the piper, John. I mean, we can't continue to borrow these records amounts of money, basically from future generations, continually without paying some price. And even the amount we've borrowed so far, there will be a price to pay, and that price will come in several ways. Number one, either a reduction in government services because more money will need to be devoted to debt servicing as opposed to spending programs. Almost certainly, as I mentioned earlier, it will result in higher taxes, and perhaps not just for upper income folks, but on a more broad basis to get the deficit down. And, the long-term cost is simply that you end up with weaker economic growth, slower long-term potential growth than would otherwise be the case, because future governments will be spending more resources devoted to debt management as opposed to supporting the economy. So there will be a cost. It's going to be spread out over probably decades, and a lot of it will be borne by either the younger generations or the next generations. Now, what squares the circle currently is that interest rates are so low. And so total federal government debt service costs, even though the total debt, public held debt as a share of GDP is approaching over 100% of GDP, those debt service payments still consume very little of overall revenues. So it's clearly manageable at the moment. But again, what it's doing is it's making the government and by implication the economy vulnerable in the event that we see a sustained spike in interest rates that ultimately sends debt service costs much higher. And again, what will happen is more of that money, more revenue will be devoted to debt servicing as opposed to government programs, and we'll need to raise taxes to sustain the debt. So it's not an issue for today or even for this year, but it will be an issue for in future years and certainly future decades. The important thing is, even though that deficit is on track to hit a record $3.5 trillion this year, as I mentioned, about 15% of GDP, it should, once some of these temporary measures come off, such as the rebate checks, which are just one-off measures, will go down to, I think, $1.8 trillion next year, according to the CBO, and then start to fall a bit further. But we're going to have to get our fiscal house in order before some of the Social Security payments start to escalate towards the end of this decade as the population continues to age and more of the baby boomers retire.
I can identify with that last comment. Dan, I'm gonna apply the math that Sal was just laying out for us to our local situation. There's a question here that it basically states, how much does the city have to pay in interest rates? I mean, when they do the debt financed program for the street repairs, what sort of interest rates are they paying, and how much are they really adding to their debt burden based on what their capacity is for borrowing money? Can you speak to those issues?
Yeah, the city council does have a self-imposed borrowing limit that has been altered over time a little bit, but it's a pretty closely held principle with city staff and city council that they don't want to get anywhere above a certain percentage. As far as what our debt service is, I'd have to pull up the exact city budget and really go through the numbers. It's probably a better question for a number cruncher at the city than a generalist like me. But I know that the concern was that, if we continue on this 8% trajectory of inflation for the street repair program, which, by the way, is a number that has been brought into question by many, but that's the number they assumed. If that stays the case and we had a status quo option, then the level of debt just does a big upward turn and gets close to our self-imposed limit. So that was the reason for, let's think about a different kind of proposal, like a transportation utility, so that we can solve this problem before it becomes critical, right? One city council member said, I equated to going to the doctor and him saying, I need to lose weight, and before something happens to me. This is the city looking at its own fiscal health and saying, we need to do something before this becomes an untenable situation. Now, you can quibble with the numbers, 8% inflation or not, but the fact is that they do want to decrease their reliance on borrowing for the street repair program. So this was just an innovative way to do so. And again, I commend them for their creative outside-the-box thinking, but this just wasn't the right proposal for the business community at this point.
My recollection from one conversation was that the city is able to borrow money at less than 1%? like 0.95%, some unreal low cost for borrowing money. But we'll follow up and let our members know the facts on those things. It brings to mind, Sal, one of those lessons from the economics classes. The city is projecting an 8% year-over-year inflation rate to the cost of building street repairs. And if I have this right, that means the rule of 72 seems to think that means all those costs will double every 9 years. Is that correct?
At that rate, it sure would. But I guess that's just for the cost of street repairs. Now, I mean, the overall inflation rate, we hope will not get anywhere close to that. We certainly do not forecast it. We will see, I mean, overall U.S. CPI inflation probably pop above 3% from 1.5% currently over the next few months, just simply because of low base effects from the outright declines in prices on the anniversary of the shutdowns. But that should be temporary. We do not expect inflation to ramp higher on a sustained basis, simply because unemployment is still elevated. Wage costs should grow at a fairly moderate rate, and ongoing use of automation continues to suppress costs. But there's no doubt there's some areas, certainly those impacted by the pandemic, where there are supply chain disruptions, for example, labor shortages in some particular industries, where you could see more intense inflation pressure. And maybe for street repairs, that is one area that unfortunately your state might have to contend with, or your city.
Yeah, let's stay with that labor market question, because we have another caller who sent us a question about an article that was in the Wall Street Journal about the headwinds that the economy is dealing with, supply chain disruptions, and the tight labor market, which, by the way, describes our market around here. We have a lot of job openings that are unfilled. But it seems that the real issue with the $15 an hour minimum wage, which is, of course, being talked about at the federal level, it may or may not impact the supply of labor. Could it be that it brings more people into the workforce at higher wages? And could that make providing further government support more challenging? In other words, shouldn't we target the aid a little bit more than a $15 an hour wage increase? Any thoughts on that proposed $15 an hour wage and what impact you think it'll have on labor markets?
Yeah, given, John, that the U.S. economy as a whole is still operating with surplus labor, because the unemployment rate, 6.3% is still well above what we thought was a sustainable level of under 4% prior to the pandemic. So on balance, there still is this surplus of labor that needs to be absorbed before you see intense wage pressures. Now, because of the unique nature of this crisis, those job losses are concentrated in those few services industries, leisure, hospitality, entertainment, where the skill set for those jobs is not as high as the average skill set. So, you have industries, technology, for example, where there's still ongoing and pronounced shortages of skilled workers, much like before the pandemic. So that's where the minimum wage, maybe there is an argument that it could be targeted at just certain industries, but I would suspect those industries that are already facing labor shortages are paying a minimum wage well above the proposed federal increase to $15 an hour. Unfortunately, because there is such a surplus of workers now in those hard-hit industries in the services sector, that's where the higher minimum wage would really discourage businesses, restaurants, for example, hotels, from hiring workers. So, until that surplus of workers was absorbed, and it could take 2 or 3 years even for some of the hardest hit sectors, the higher minimum wage will likely result in less employment than would otherwise be the case. And that's one of the reasons the Congressional Budget Office estimates a combined 1.4 million loss of jobs attributed to this minimum wage. The other reason is because those higher minimum wages, though they will benefit workers that keep their jobs, will also result in higher prices, which will slow the economy a little bit and cost a few jobs as well. So overall, this would probably not be the best time to hike the federal minimum wage, which is maybe one reason it won't be. It actually won't pass through the American Rescue Plan bill that's now going through Congress. It might be something governments might want to entertain perhaps next year or so when the unemployment rate is much lower.
Very insightful. Thank you, Sal. Dan, we have another question here about next steps. What do you see the city doing as a result of last night's meeting? Is this proposal going to come back in some different form? What is your expectation?
Possibly it could come back in a similar form. I think the dust is still settling over at City Hall, frankly. I know that they had put a lot of time and resources into studying this one particular transportation utility option, including many, many, many hours of meetings. So it's tough to say how they're going to regroup. I have heard, as I said earlier, from several city council members, even today, saying, let's get a group together and let's start to talk this stuff out. So we're very optimistic in terms of what the future actions for the city might be, and we're very gratified to have a seat at the table. I think the business community, nobody really saw the numbers until early February, and I think the businesses would have liked to have known a little bit earlier about what this proposal could have meant for them. So looking for some good transparency and some good conversations with the city about really a 360-degree look at how we finance transportation here in Janesville. And we may be able to come up with some innovative solutions yet that could set us apart from other communities. So we look forward to the conversations, but there's no strong established written down timeline at this point of how those meetings will go and whether it's an officially sanctioned committee or whether it's just a kind of an ad hoc get together bar napkin kind of deal. But we'll just have to wait and see. We're ready to act, certainly, because we do recognize that this is a problem and that the way that the city finances this program is unsustainable. So we are ready for the conversations to happen.
All right. And Sal, I have one more question. It has an international focus, and that is China, of course, is an inordinately important trading partner. I think they're still a buyer of our government debt, but there's obviously been some challenges in our relationship with China. I assume that is something someone in your position keeps a keen eye on. When it comes to this administration, where do you see our relationship with China headed?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S.-China trade relations will change all that much under the new administration, John, simply because President Biden is considered a so-called China hawk, much like ex-President Trump. And there's no plans at the moment to rescind the tariffs on China. So, yeah, he'll probably treat the U.S. allies more with kid gloves, but I don't think the relationship between the U.S. and China will change all that much. We'll see. We haven't heard too much out of the new administration yet on that front, but that's the one area that is not expected to change all that much going forward.
As an investor, would I look to Europe, and now that the UK is on its own, is that something that you can comment on in terms of the near-term future of those economies?
Well, I think all economies will come roaring back this year, some quicker than others. The U.S. will be at the forefront, I believe, just because it's rolling out its vaccination program more aggressively than other countries, and because of the massive amount of fiscal stimulus. So it will rebound faster, perhaps than Canada, and certainly a little quicker than most of Europe, where some countries like Germany right now are still basically in lockdown. So, but all advanced countries will come roaring back this year. It's just a question of time. Europe might see a faster recovery in the second half of the year and through next year, as opposed to the U.S., where already as of this quarter, it already seems to be on fire. So as far as investment, I mean that's always. Or just getting back to that infrastructure question, I think that the key for investing is to know which way the winds are blowing, and even with respect to infrastructure. President Biden is basically tying in a lot of the proposed infrastructure spending to his Green New Deal. The environment, for example, I believe. I mean, he wants to. He's aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. To do that, he's planning to spend about $1.7 trillion over the next decade on green technology. Promoting electric vehicles, battery recharging stations, rail travel, for example. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of the direction of where a lot of investment will be flowing over the next few years.
I can't help but ask one of my own questions, and that is, I've been tracking economic performance most of my adult life, and this is the oddest economic transformation I've ever seen over 1 year's time, where you have sectors that are really hammered, and then, as we've seen around here, we have sectors in food and technology and plastics, and they're just growing like gangbusters, and we have a housing market just exploded. It's just odd. It's not really a recession in the classical sense. Can you put a little bow on this particular year's economic performance and how different it has been?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right, John. I mean, there's nothing to compare to what we have seen in the past year for the economy, unless perhaps you go back to 1918 and the Spanish flu, although we don't have the good industry data to see what the breakdown was like. But even during the 1956 and 1968 mini pandemics globally and in the U.S., we did not see this kind of economic damage or polarization across industries, because it really is just those few industries, personal services industries, that were most impacted by the restrictions and by changes in consumer behavior, because people wanted to avoid getting the virus, that you saw most of the economic damage. While, at the same time, the pandemic was accelerating previous trends towards online shopping, for example, and even remote working. So, technology companies that were able to tap into that shift just came out, far ahead than even, where they were going into the pandemic. So it's a very unique type of situation, and certainly very unique shutdown recession that we experienced a year ago. And even the recovery now is quite unusual in that, some of the hardest hit industries that are still facing restrictions are very slow to come back. Restaurants, for example, across many states. But other sectors of the economy, manufacturing, for example, because we're buying a lot more goods, even though we're spending less on services, are doing very well and thriving. And, of course, the housing market has been a ball of fire for several months now. So very unique situation. Again, like nothing we have seen probably, at least in the past century.
Well, thank you so much, Hal, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have you share your perspective on the economy, and pass along, please, to everybody there our appreciation for BMO Harris sponsorship of this series of conference calls. We appreciate your time. I also want to thank Oakleigh Ryan and Dan Cunningham for joining us. As we wrote in the promotion for this, we will discuss issues from the White House all the way to your house, and I think we accomplished that today. So thanks, everybody, for joining us, and look for promotion of a call next month of a similar nature. And I hope you have a safe and healthy day and week. Talk to you later.